Bakhmut. What on earth is going on in Bakhmut? Are we witnessing the beginnings of a Russian counter-counterattack? Is Ukraine setting a trap? Is this just a winter slowdown? Or is it something else entirely? In contrast to the slow-moving events of today, where it seems you could turn off the news for weeks without missing much, except for mounting casualties on both sides, the end of summer and beginning of fall 2022 was a fascinating time for observers of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Over the course of the first 6 months of fighting, Russia had shaved off a large chunk of eastern Ukraine. Heading into that summer, the conventional wisdom was that Ukraine would have to wait until at least the spring of 2023 before it would be able to mount an effective counterattack on the territory that Russia had acquired at the start of the conflict, and enjoy celebrations like this one. Instead, Ukraine rapidly injected forces into the north. Before Russia could respond, Ukraine made a series of lightning strikes to the east beginning on September 6th. Throughout that time, Ukraine had also kept up pressure against Kherson toward the south, and on November 9th, rather than fight what its leaders thought would be a losing battle, Russia withdrew its forces across the Dnipro River. As a result, the celebration that seemed destined for May of the following year came 6 months early. The question then turned to where Ukraine would strike next. Consensus opinion was that a drive down Zaporizhia to the Sea of Azov was the most likely option. That would split Russia's land bridge to Crimea, give Ukraine a way to attack the remainder of Kherson without having to cross the Dnipro, and eventually allow Ukraine to flank Russia over in the Donbass. But back to the line of control after November. For all that public speculation, as the calendar turned toward the new year, you can see here the progress made on the front lines. There was a lot of movement there for anyone to process, Vladimir Putin included. So understandably, you might be confused about what you just witnessed. To resolve that, let's focus in here and go to the slow-motion instant replay. Okay, not exactly lighting up the world right now. Basically, it's Ukraine losing control of the town of Soledar, and maybe parts of Bakhmut, though the latter part remains unclear. The changes here are notable because Highway M03 crosses through Bakhmut, and otherwise would connect Kyiv and Kharkiv to the Donbass. Outside of that, something small may also have happened here, but the reports are inconclusive on that front. Totaling up the pre-war population counts across these locations, even assuming complete Russian successes, shows that very little has actually changed, especially considering that Bakhmut's interim war population has dropped to only a few thousand. To be clear, none of this accounts for day-to-day combat, which has marginally moved the front lines over territory that neither side finds valuable. For a different perspective, looking at the monthly sums of territorial exchanges in terms of percentage of total Ukrainian territory, the picture is clear. Ukraine has stopped making progress. In fact, the mild regress began raising questions of whether this was a turning point in the war. At the very least, it became evident that we had moved to a fourth phase of the conflict, and the second period of a stalemate. So what actually is going on with the war in Ukraine? Let's cover 4 possibilities that explain the slowdown observed over winter, and how likely each is to be true, ranging from a favorable interpretation for Ukraine to an impending disaster. But first, getting accurate news these days is difficult, whether we are talking about the war in Ukraine, politics at home, or otherwise. Ground News is an app and website that allows you to see how breaking news is covered across the political spectrum. Moreover, it tabulates your own media consumption by political bias. My consumption comes primarily from balanced sources, with a bit from the left and the right. It's pretty close to the French tricolor. One of Ground News's coolest features is the map on its mobile app. You can go to specific locations and see what is happening there. You might not see lines on maps, but the cool circles preview available stories. You can also follow topics to track breaking news on a particular person, location, or event, like Joe Biden, Ukraine, or the Ukraine crisis. For more, go to ground.news/linesonmaps to stay fully informed on breaking news as it's happening. Sign up for free or subscribe for unlimited access. And thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Now back to the range of winter possibilities. And first up to explain the seasonal slowdown is the default expectation. It's just winter. Remember that this is what everyone was anticipating before Ukraine's surprise summer counterattack. Supposedly, summer was not going to be an option because Ukraine did not have enough well-trained soldiers. Late fall was going to be off the table because of rain and Rasputitsa mud clogging up tires and tank tracks. And depending on the temperature, winter could continue the Rasputitsa problem, or create different logistical problems with projecting power, though we have previously discussed why this was far from guaranteed. In any case, from this perspective, everything is going according to Ukraine's plan. The earlier counterattacks were just pleasant bonuses for Ukraine that may have created unrealistic expectations in the media. The counterattacks will continue whenever the winter weather permits them to. After all, peak freeze does not occur in January. It's more like February, which is why Russia chose that as the invasion date in 2022. The point is that a winter offensive is still possible, though, like last year, things have been fairly warm in Ukraine so far, meaning that a true freeze may never arise. In that case, we will see Ukraine pick things back up in March, or April, or whenever springtime rain subsides for long enough to dry the areas that Ukraine wishes to target. There are some signs that Ukraine is preparing for that. HIMARS artillery has steadily been hitting targets in Zaporizhia. You may remember that HIMARS strikes were a critical preliminary step for the eastern Kherson counterattacks, with Ukraine targeting 3 bridges that cross the Dnipro River into the area surrounding Kherson City. At first, this forced Russia to commit troops to protecting the city, leaving the east wide open. Then later, it isolated those troops and eventually forced Russia to retreat. There is not an obvious strategy that Ukraine is using with its HIMARS targets in Zaporizhia. However, it is possible that something coherent is happening, and we will better understand it after the fact. In the meantime, the relatively stationary battlefield will see some aforementioned ebbs and flows. From this perspective, the losses at Soledar and perhaps Bakhmut are not the end of the world for Ukraine. Remember, the areas have been shelled so much that they are not inherently valuable anymore. Russia has made a small strategic gain by possessing them as a part of a logistical network, and denying that to Ukraine, but that is it. Obviously, Ukraine would prefer to control them, but losing them does not impact any future counterattack plans. On the broader spectrum, if this is what's truly going on, it's mildly good news for Ukraine. I believe that trust the process is the phrase for it. A second possibility is that Ukraine is setting a trap to let Russia destroy itself. This theory attempts to explain what we might call the Bakhmut puzzle, the idea that Bakhmut is not particularly valuable, and yet both sides appear to be committing unreasonably large quantities of resources into capturing and defending it. One explanation is that the conventional wisdom on this is just wrong. Bakhmut is actually critical, but no one is capable of articulating why. And maybe that is true. Let's not dismiss the possibility that Putin is up to something clever. But let's look past that for a moment. Maybe instead it is Ukraine that is up to something. The common explanation for Russia's apparent obsession with Bakhmut is its internal divisions. In particular, the Wagner Group has been chiefly responsible for the assault on Bakhmut. Officially speaking, the Wagner Group is a management consulting and book publishing organization. Unofficially, it is a mercenary company. Most analysts believe that Putin has, at minimum, indirect oversight over it, writing the checks and approving the plans. Wagner's fight for Bakhmut is not over the city per se, but rather so that Wagner leadership can prove to Putin how effective the group is in the war. If we return to the data on changes to territorial possession and extend it back further, we see that more than half a year has passed since Russia has made any notable progress on its territorial ambitions. Moreover, the initial failure to take Kyiv was in part a consequence of how poorly run the traditional Russian military was. Wagner sees this as an opportunity. If the group appears more effective than the actual Russian military, Putin might funnel more resources into it, effectively replacing all of the Russian regulars. In other words, Bakhmut itself is irrelevant. It is just a proving ground for parochial interests within Russia. By this theory, Ukraine is all too happy to devote resources to defending Bakhmut. Oddly, the losses Ukraine is incurring to defend the city is not worth its value. Instead, this is just a giant exercise to cause disproportionate harm to Russia. Because Putin would rather take away whatever windfall he promised should Wagner withdraw, the group is forced to keep throwing cannon fodder at the situation. By playing this game, Ukraine is reorienting resources that would otherwise go to productive counterattacks elsewhere. But this is a winning strategy for Ukraine in the long run. It will create even worse manpower deficiencies for Russia, meaning that when Ukraine finally gets around to its next counterattack, the probability of success will be even higher. The high body counts also increase the chances that Putin's domestic popularity becomes a thing of the past. Adoring crowds like these could become angry mobs, which might allow Ukraine to win the war without having to go city by city. However, there are a couple of big assumptions baked into this theory. First is that the casualty rates are indeed disproportionately advantaging Ukraine. As you can see, the figures on this are all over the place. Such is the nature of war and competing propaganda. At a minimum, both sides are reporting that the other is facing 100 casualties or more on a regular basis. Ukraine claims 5-digit Russian casualties overall, though it is hard to discern what portion of those are regular Russian troops and what portion is Wagner. Given that there is a big difference in quality between seasoned Russian regulars and Wagner ex-prisoners and fresh mercenaries, that difference matters. Regardless of the true numbers, at some level, Ukraine is paying a premium on quality for the trade. An open question is how much larger the Russian losses need to be for this to be an even trade or better for Ukraine. Second, the theory is predicated on Putin not realizing how bad Russian losses are, if they truly are as disastrous as the Ukrainian figures indicate. The standard narrative ignores this as a precondition for the theory to work in favor of Ukraine, but it is critical for it to be true. After all, why would Putin reward Wagner for taking a town of minor importance if it costs Russia thousands and thousands of lives? Implicitly, I think this is because observers reason that Putin does not internalize the cost of Russian casualties. That is a strong assumption. Even if Putin does not directly care about the loss of life, remembering that Wagner is largely recruiting from prisons at this point, the deceased prisoner soldiers still have family members that do. This, in turn, further strains domestic political problems. But even if the costs of the deceased did not matter to him, Putin still wants to win the war, and that is an incredible quantity of resources lost that could have been put to better use elsewhere. It would be the very definition of a Pyrrhic victory, or, as economists would point out, Putin's opportunity cost might be too high. Is it plausible that Putin is in the dark? Yes. We have talked before about how that was a major reason why the war started. But Putin undoubtedly has learned that his own information asymmetry was a problem, and has tried to fix it since then. That said, we have also discussed how the root cause is an institutional problem, which runs deep, so fixing it may be easier said than done. Putin might still have an information gap. It does not help that Wagner's quasi-independence adds a layer of complication for using traditional military channels to learn accurate casualty figures. And while Bakhmut has been the focus of this conversation because it dominates media coverage, which itself is a consequence of the high casualty count, this may be Ukraine's broader strategy along the line of control for the winter. If this is the true story, it would be very good news for Ukraine. Possibility number 3 is that we are actually observing a stalemate. This would be the result of Russia's secondary mobilization. Following Ukraine's advances east of Kharkiv, and then reinforced by Russia's retreat from Kherson, it became evident that what Moscow needed to keep the war going was to flood the front lines with more troops. After months of delay on the implementation, perhaps the strategy is finally paying off for Russia, and Putin will at last be satisfied with the military's performance. By most accounts, this is bad news for Ukraine. There is a reason why the theme photo for this video is the trenches. Every day the war goes nowhere makes life more difficult for Kyiv's end mission, because Russia can get further entrenched, literally, with its gains. That is a major part of why Ukraine has not made any progress in reacquiring the original separatist areas, which would require getting all the way to here. Ukraine's strategy thus far for the counteroffensives is to revert the borders back to the February 2022 status quo. Beating Russian reinforcements to the punch was also part of why the summer's counterattack was such a big deal, and probably prompted Ukraine to accelerate its plans back then. The question will then turn to what the West will do. The popular narrative that Russia is favored in a long war is overstated at a minimum, or at least it presupposes that the West will lose interest, begin caring more about mountain retreats, cut its support to Ukraine, and implicitly force Kyiv to concede some portion of its territory. However, the truth is that economies win long wars, so long as those economies are committed to the fight. Commitment can be a problem when the supporting economy is taking on casualties. The US experiences in Vietnam and Mogadishu illustrate this. It can also be a problem if there is no clear mission, as the United States also experienced in its second decade in Afghanistan. Neither of those seem to be a problem here, which is good news for Ukraine. And there likely will not be much concern for Ukraine until at least 2024, when Joe Biden may not run for re-election, or try but lose. The data tell a clear story here. Before the war, using UN data from 2020, Russia's GDP was $1.5 trillion. Ukraine's was only $155 billion, which pales in comparison. But imagine you combined the GDPs of the United States at $21 trillion, Germany at $3.8 trillion, the United Kingdom at $2.8 trillion, France at $2.6 trillion, Italy at $1.9 trillion, Canada at $1.6 trillion, the Netherlands at $900 billion, Poland at $600 billion, the Czech Republic at $245 billion, Lithuania at $57 billion, Latvia at $34 billion, and Estonia at $31 billion. Then you get something close to $36 trillion. Looking at the bilateral relationship, it's not even close in Russia's favor. But factor in those selected NATO countries, and it's not even close against Russia. Obviously, the West is not going to be singularly focused on the war effort, like Ukraine will be. But even if only 10% of it counts, the coalition still doubles Russia's total. And that's before you factor in the economic sanctions that are squeezing the Russian economy, and therefore its ability to produce weapons. In sum, the long run only favors Russia if the West grows disinterested. Thus, if this is a true stalemate, the news for Ukraine is either mildly bad if you think the West is here to stay, or outright bad if you think the West will waver. The final possibility is that we are observing the beginnings of a true Russian counteroffensive. In other words, Russia's small gains in Bakhmut represent the first domino of more to fall later. But where would Russia go? Crossing the Dnipro River would be a perilous proposition. As such, one likely target is Zaporizhia, east of the river's bend. For Russia, this has the added benefit of preemptively denying a Ukrainian counterattack from that location. It would also give Russia a chance of capturing Zaporizhia city, something it has not done during the war, despite having officially annexed the territory, according to Russian law. And right there is the signature that did it. The other choice is to push outward in Donetsk, like this. Russia has basically ignored the western half of the oblast since the beginning of the war, except the parts necessary to form the Crimean land bridge. This is where the Bakhmut offensive is taking place, though there is always the possibility that this is a feint and the real action will be elsewhere. Regardless of the target, under this interpretation, the mobilization that Putin announced on September 21st is really paying off. Not only are the front lines now secured for Russia, but Russia can initiate a counter-counterattack without much fear. It may also be part of some new, broader war strategy that Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov has put into place since taking over that role on November 9th. This interpretation is something that Ukraine must consider, though it is less likely than you might think, even if your prior belief was already very low. Recently, Western powers have not shown much urgency in their delivery of aid to Ukraine. This is highlighted by the will they, won't they drama with the Leopard 2 tanks from Germany and the M1 Abrams tanks from the United States, which seems to have been mostly resolved by now. Sometimes it has been a friendly conversation between the partners. Sometimes it has been dicey. But as we have discussed before, negotiating over aid packages is a common problem between patron and protégé states. Protégé states just want to receive as much aid as possible, because their incentive is to push the expected outcome of the war as far from their heartlands as they can. For them, there is no trade-off between power acquisition and the associated costs. That is because the patron tends to be the one footing the bill. Thus, patrons care about whether they are getting enough bang for their buck. This has been a bigger issue in the United States since November, after Republicans won enough seats to take control of the House of Representatives. Though, as we discussed just a moment ago, it is the presidency that really matters on this issue. In any case, if Western countries really were worried about a Russian offensive, they would have been much more eager to get the supplies delivered in an expedient manner. The West would like Ukraine to re-establish its old borders, but it places even more value on Ukraine continuing to be a viable political entity, at least on some level. Thus, if Ukraine were about to encounter a disaster, the West would want to take proactive steps to stop it. Moreover, the risk that Russia would retaliate against the West for tank shipments would be low. After all, Ukraine would have a hard time using them offensively, Russia's chief complaint, if Ukraine were about to be caught on its back foot. But the West was generally slow to make good on the tanks. That means either 1, a productive Russian offensive is not going to happen, or 2, the West has its intelligence on this incorrect. It is possible that Western intelligence is wrong. It has happened before, particularly with the US assessment that Russia would quickly conquer Ukraine. However, at the same time, US estimates were spot on with Russia's intent from the get-go. This suggests that US intelligence has better access to what is going on in the minds of senior Russian officials, and, ironically, is equally in the dark about the quality of Russian forces. Or at least was at the start of the war anyway. Consequently, it is possible that US intelligence is wrong again here, but it is not as likely as it may seem given the previous miscalculation. In any case, it may still take a moment before we witness any of this. Russia needed months to mobilize its 200,000 soldiers to the border on the eve of the war, before ultimately turning them into an invasion force. Rumors are swirling that Russia might add 500,000 more. If that were to happen, they would need a long lead-up time. There are some indications that Russia has begun pushing this preparation phase, but it remains unclear when they will complete the process. Russia still has systemic issues with its military, of course, so the deployment does not guarantee a Russian success. But it is also a fallacy to assume that Russia is incapable of learning from its mistakes, especially because manpower shortages were a major factor in its failed push toward Kyiv originally. This point cannot be emphasized enough. As we have discussed before, Russia's battle plan at the start of the war was predicated on many Ukrainians simply giving up. Under that assumption, Russia could get away with having the same number of troops as Ukraine, despite attackers traditionally needing a 3-to-1 edge. Had Russia simply mobilized en masse from the start, they may well have succeeded, despite their infamous equipment problems. Well, it seems that Russia may be mobilizing like that now. As such, if the winter battles we are observing truly are a prelude to a Russian offensive, it would be the worst outcome from Ukraine's perspective. There is, however, another possibility that we are witnessing a true Russian offensive, but that it is still moderately good news for Ukraine. If Russia is really worried about the tanks and suspects they are going to come soon, then Moscow has a strong incentive to order preventive action, even if it comes at a high price. In other words, Russia right now is fighting to control Donetsk or Zaporizhia or wherever will become more difficult to conquer once the tanks are in play. As such, snow be damned, Russia is doing as much as it can as quickly as it can before the tanks will shut its window of opportunity. After all, windows can be dangerous in Russia, especially when they are on a high floor. Obviously, this should not sound great from the Ukrainian perspective. That's why the rank is here and not here. But the reason it is not all the way back here is because the threat of tanks is forcing Russia to act sooner than it might want to otherwise. That is beneficial to Ukraine in the long run. And in the even longer run, they will have the tanks to counteract any short-run gains that Russia might make. Which of the 4 possibilities do you think is most likely? Let me know in the comments. If you want to know more about the invasion, you will love my book that examines the causes of it. Check below for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. Last time, we discussed how interesting things are sometimes hiding in the pictures right in front of us. Many of you correctly identified that it was in fact Steven Seagal at Putin's 2018 inauguration. Well done. Now, what else might be out there?